Now, well, where was I? Right. So the compulsion, the idea that art draws one in, that is what it means for art to be engaging. But why is this desirable for art, for it to draw one in? Well, I mean, other than the fact that it makes it entertaining, it's a good way to spend some time, de-stress perhaps. But one of the other aspects of the idea of engagement and why that word is separate from compulsion in essence, even though I can use them interchangeably, is that engaging with something is active. It's something that you do. A compulsion is not something that you activate on your own. And so an engaging item, while you may be compelled to start on it, ultimately you make the decision with each passing moment to actually interact with it. You continue to make decisions with each passing second, particularly even with this. I guess we'll call it a podcast that I'm speaking right now. You're making a decision every moment to continue to engage with it. But yes, even with something such as this podcast, where I'm continually making the decision to engage with it. To engage with something is not simply to be drawn in. To be engaged by something is not simply to be drawn into it, but to continue to interact with it. And when you make a piece of art, one of the things with it is that even for something as static as a painting, you interact with it, although not in the most standard of senses. You interact with it so much as you are trying to figure out what does it say. And this is the interesting thing about stylization. Because, going back to my earlier example of saying something, right? The dog is black. Well, there's nothing to interpret out of that, right? I've just said that a dog is black. Well, the dog is black, I should say. There's nothing really engaging about it. I've given you the message, you know what the message is, and it's a done deal. But, as stated back then, if I go, the dog is black, suddenly we have an additional meaning that has been overloaded into this, or rather, there's an overloaded meaning in the phrase. But it's not about the dog. It's about who's speaking. Why would they have such a dark and, we'll say, marbly voice, dark and marbled voice? That particular quandary is what you're engaging with. That is the thing that makes it a little bit more engaging, because it has produced a question in your mind that you are interacting with. This is what is intimated when somebody is looking at the Mona Lisa and they say, why is she smiling? And why is her smile like that? What was Da Vinci thinking when he brought her on? What is behind that smile? You're engaging with the picture, or rather, you're engaging with the quandary that the picture presents. Even though, in all reality, no question was ever stated. It was implied, or rather, it was created by your own mind. This is the magic of art, in a sense. because the stylization causes an additional statement to be added into the expression, an unspoken statement, oftentimes. Indeed, most art is comprised almost entirely of unspoken statements. It is the literary arts that are entirely spoken statements, but even then, just by the juxtaposition of certain words with each other, we put unspoken statements in between the lines, in between the letters, and in between the words. It is a rather fascinating execution of things, and perhaps, in some sense, one of the barest forms of art, next to music, perhaps. But this, brings you to this question of, okay, so stylization of the expression that is art, it is there to compel engagement and then to drive engagement, done by creating these extra questions and also creating launching points for intimations and imaginings regarding the art. And so, in my estimation, that is a measure for which one can use, that is a measure that one can use to figure out good or bad art. Is that idea of, how many quandaries does it create outside of the initial statement? Is it just there on its face and it's just kind of bland? Or is it so stylized that it ultimately just says nothing? In my estimation, that is much of what makes abstract art so hard to appreciate. Because, in a sense, it's all style and no substance, at least in my opinion. It's focused more on the process of creating the art than necessarily on the means, the meaning that the art is intended to do. This is a great overstatement, perhaps, but I don't know. When you see something where somebody says they put a toilet seat on the wall and call it a piece of art, I mean, yes, it's definitely sparks a quandary in one's mind. Why did you put a toilet seat on the wall? But it doesn't really say anything. I mean, other than, look at this, I put a toilet seat on the wall. Isn't it neat? Beyond that, it's just there to make you question. And while, in the words of Bashir, the question is often greater than its answer, it doesn't change the fact that, ultimately, the piece on its own says nothing. At that point, the piece is making the viewer, the engager, as it were, do all the work. And in reality, art that, let's say, inspires and delights, what they inspire is those questions and explorations, things that you can interact with. I think to some of the greatest games that I've played in the past where the world itself is so interesting. It creates a number of assumptions and ideas in one's mind and allows one to continue to exist in the world. And it's not just a matter of there being a playground for the person to look through, but there's a series of rules and ideas that lay a groundwork for one to continue forward and to logic out new futures, new pasts, new elements and ideas. Essentially, it is something that doesn't just stop with that first interaction. So, in other words, rolling back to where we started here, which is that idea of what engagement is. Engagement is being compelled. Engagement is interaction, ultimately. But it is interaction not simply in the physical sense, but also in the mental and emotional sense. The piece stirs something in you. It creates a launching point for investigation, so to speak. But even as I say it, I am having a hard time coming up with a concise definition. Perhaps I will have to think on this a little bit longer. Yes. Let us consider this for a bit, for a while.